This video is sponsored by Clip Studio Paint. In this video, I'll be talking about my digital painting process, how I use gradient maps, and sharing my favorite digital brushes, all in one painting demo. Clip Studio Paint is a really amazing drawing and painting software with so many great tools and features for any level of digital artist. I've been using Clip Studio Paint ever since it used to be called Manga Studio 5 back in like the mid 2010s, which I guess was almost 10 years ago now. Oh my gosh. I really love the painting brushes, but I kind of let my license collect dust because I was still really uncomfortable with digital drawing and painting and didn't really have a great tablet. I only started to seriously use it more recently when I was in school and now on my channel as I continue my digital drawing and painting journey. So I'm really excited to share my whole process today and hopefully help you if you're interested in getting Clip Studio Paint or needing some help if you already have it. I use it both on my desktop and iPad, and for this specific demo, I'll be mainly focusing on the iPad version. When I initially tried the iPad version, I was a bit skeptical with how well it would perform and what would be included in the interface, but I was really surprised with how powerful and similar the iPad version was to the original desktop version. Now I consider it a staple part of my art workflow. I was also worried that my screen space would be taken up with a ton of tabs. I have the iPad 11-inch, so it's a bit of a smaller screen. I can enable the simple mode on my iPad and have more working screen space. This mode is only on the smartphone and tablet version of Clip Studio Paint. You can try Clip Studio Paint for 3 months for free on your Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, or Chromebook devices using my link in the description. First, we want to set up a good document size for a digital painting. One of the most important aspects of painting digitally is making sure you're working at least 300 dpi for your image resolution so that when you save your file as a JPEG or a PNG or whatever file, the resolution isn't low and it doesn't turn out really blurry and crunchy. I typically do 350 dpi to 600 because I really like that crispness of it, and I really like the ability to like size it up or print it at larger sizes, but do know that the larger the dpi, like the larger the file size, so it may take things longer to load and it may take up more space on your tablet or computer. Then you want to pick the dimension you want for your painting. I'm going for more of a squarish rectangular ratio for this specific painting, but you can always change the dimensions in the Clip Studio settings later if you want a bigger or smaller canvas. Okay, now that you have your canvas, if you're feeling a little worried about all the different tabs and features, if you are on your phone or tablet, you can easily switch to the simple mode. Don't worry, you can always switch back to the studio mode if you need extra tools, but this simpler interface can help you a lot in getting started or help when you're really trying to focus on the painting and not get distracted by all the tabs. And once you have everything set up, you can just start drawing and planning out your painting. For this specific painting I'm working on, I've been inspired by springtime aesthetics and flowers and just the warmer weather. Really nice, so I decided on a tea party garden scene featuring my own characters, of course. Strawberry Sol and Blueberry Bill. You can learn more about them in the videos linked in the cards above. Something about this idea of two cowboys sipping tea and enjoying a peaceful garden, blooming with spring flowers. It's that artist part of my brain, and I knew I wanted to go with this idea. I want to briefly talk about my sketching phase. I always love doing a bunch of messy preliminary sketches to work out poses, composition, and really explore what I want to achieve with a piece. Also, I've been on the hunt for like a HB style pencil brush and found this amazing brush pack on the Clip Studio Assets site. I'll link the brush pack I'm using down below. It's called the Artemis Pencil by the creator Artemis, and yeah, I'll have it linked down below if you're interested in downloading it as well. I fell in love with it and I basically used it for the whole sketching process of this project, and I think it'll be my new favorite for the next couple of pieces. I would say this is really a really important part of my process, but also one of the most difficult parts since you're basically starting from nothing and it involves a lot of like creative input. Generally, I just try and brainstorm, do some thumbnailing to find the composition that I like the most, finding a good flow in the gesture of the poses, working out the technicalities of perspective, and overall just like working out the proportions of different aspects of the piece. Thinking of things simply like just shapes helps me to not get caught up in the detail and really stay loose in this whole process. Once I find a thumbnail I like, I sketch over it, figuring out the structure, especially if there are any figures and any anatomy I need to figure out. This is a really good time to look at pose references and work out any issues that may pop up later on in the piece. A really good thing to remember while carving out more of these details and finalizing things is to make sure to flip your canvas every now and again. You can easily flip your canvas horizontally in Clip Studio Paint, as well as like zoom out a lot. You want to keep in mind the entire composition to maintain the initial energy and flow of your sketch. And flipping your canvas and zooming in and out can help you catch really simple mistakes. As someone who struggles a lot with keeping the original magic and energy of the sketch, this is what has been really helping me to stay on track and get the energy that I want. Like I said before, as you're structuring out this more detailed version of the sketch and finalizing more of your composition, this is the best time to use reference to accurately describe objects in your paintings. So further down the line, you're not halfway through your painting and realizing you drew something completely wrong. This still ends up happening to me because I'm still learning and you're always going to make some sort of mistake in the beginning, but this definitely helps to mitigate future problems. For this painting in particular, I compiled a ton of references of tea party tables, people sitting, references of my own character designs, and references of the flowers I wanted to feature in this piece. I find having a really strong sketch or line art prior to painting cuts out a lot of guesswork in the future and makes the actual painting part a lot more fun, where you can just focus on color and rendering. Sometimes I'm able to nail the sketch refinement on the first go, but more often than not, I like to do a second pass, almost like a looser line art layer. More recently, I've been trying to achieve a cleaner look with my paintings, so I find doing one more pass to draw over everything and really refine my composition really helps to cut down on excessive lines and scribbles in the final piece. And it saves time having to clean them up later while painting. It just really makes the whole process more efficient. I'm still trying to get more clean and more efficient with my lines and really improve my line quality, but this is what's been helping me currently. For this specific painting, after I got a really clear sketch of my characters, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do for the background. I knew I wanted it to be a foliage heavy scene with lots of flowers, but I didn't just want it to be like a solid wall of flowers being the backdrop for the characters, so I spent the next phase of this piece quickly painting out some background ideas to really figure out what I want. I mainly used the Lasso tool and the Airbrush tool together to get both hard and soft edges to describe the background, generally keeping things loose and less detailed so that it doesn't take away from the main subject of the painting. So don't worry, doing these quick paintings for the background follow a lot of the rules I'll mention later in the rendering part of this video, so if you want to skip to that point now, I'll have a timestamp on screen. I find that a lot of the times when I don't have a particular image in mind for what I want to paint, and just more of like a general idea, I find that studying a lot of references and getting some inspiration from photos and other artwork really works for getting closer to the vibe that I want, and just like painting a ton and just like thinking through painting. A general rule of thumb I follow for backgrounds is to really focus on light and atmosphere and keeping it simple so that it doesn't distract too much from your main focus of your painting. And in this case, my main focus is the characters, but if your main focus of the painting is the landscape or environment, then feel free to go crazy and put a ton of detail in it. Doing all of this prep work and planning allows me to explore possible ideas that I never thought of if I had just gone with my first initial painting mock-up. This additional painting also saves me a lot of frustration when I'm deeper into the painting, when things are a lot more harder to change. Once again, keeping things loose and experimental in the beginning, not getting too attached to one idea makes the process ultimately a lot more fun and exciting and satisfying for me. I think better and faster through these quick paintings for backgrounds instead of meticulously drawing in detail and structure like the figure. Switching between these different modes kind of gives me a better sense of the atmosphere of a painting and what the final color palette will be. The atmosphere around your characters heavily influence the colors of your characters, so I find painting the background first, then coloring the main subject makes lighting and coloring a lot easier. You're basically painting out a setting to put your characters in later. So super simple in theory, but it's definitely a little bit more complicated in execution if you're a beginner. I ended up really liking one of the thumbnails I painted, and ultimately I was gonna repaint it in the main file, but I ended up just saving a copy of it and resizing it to fit the background of the painting, and it worked perfectly. I separated the front bushes from the background trees so it'd be easier to edit further down the line, and I also added some details using a leaf brush I downloaded from the assets library. With Clip Studio Paint, once again, the assets library is your best friend. I would really recommend go checking it out. I always have issues getting too caught up in the details of leaves, and this leaf brush really gave me a strong foundation to paint on top of later. It's finally time to put the figures back in. So typically for my digital paintings, right now I prefer to start painting in grayscale before I add color. Value plays a huge role in painting and clarity. Sometimes I jump in straight with color for smaller projects, but more often than not, for like larger projects like this, I start in grayscale. This also helps to train my eyes to think in value in relation to color when I'm painting. Maybe in the future, I won't have to rely on this method as much. This is just what works for me now. I basically put down some general tonal flats for the figures, then started to layer on multiply layers to map out the shadows. I chose to make the figures stand out from the background by making them darker than the background, since we generally interpret darker objects closer to us in a composition and lighter things typically fall back in a composition. Kind of like when you see a landscape with a mountain range in the back, because of the atmospheric perspective, those mountains are typically bluer and lighter than the objects in front of them. When I was mapping out the shadows of the figures, I needed to figure out what direction the light was coming from, how strong the light was in the setting, and like what type of light source it was. In this case, these figures are in the shadow of a tree, which has diffused the overhead early afternoon sunlight, making the lighting softer and more even when it lights the figures. Kind of like when you're filming something and you cover the lamp with a piece of paper to get more even lightings for your subject. It softens the shadows and makes the total object easier to see. If you're having trouble figuring out the lighting of your scene, think about what your light source is. So is it the sun, the moon, a candle, overhead electrical lights, and think about what direction is coming from in the composition and if anything is blocking it or filtering it. You also want to consider any objects around your figure that could potentially bounce light off its surface. I know this may sound a little complicated, so I'll make sure to link some tutorials down below about painting light and shadow. I know Prickly Alpaca has a really great Clip Studio Paint tutorial about light and shadow, so I'll link that down below. In this scene, I want it to seem like Bill and Saul are under a tree, so the strongest lighting will be coming from behind them, from outside the tree, the light that's bouncing off the leaves and the foliage behind them, kind of creating this glowing effect and like this rim lighting effect. And there'll also be a very soft diffuse light coming from above, from the leaves filtering out the light from the sun, but there won't be any harsh cast shadows being created. So I just followed this lighting source map and got to work on shading and rendering out those shadows. Ambient light can also come into play into this piece. The tea set may reflect some light onto Bill and Saul's face, but I'm really not too concerned with those details right now. I'm just laying down those like general shadows and highlights. Yeah, I would really recommend looking at Prickly Alpaca's shading tutorial for Clip Studio Paint. It's extremely helpful in these more technical shading aspects. This is also where edges come into play. Cast shadows typically have a harsher edge, while shadows that describe form have a softer edge. And since I don't have a lot of strong lighting causing cast shadows specifically in this painting, a lot of the edges of my values end up being softer. Edges play a huge role in a lot of painting and rendering. Have you ever done one of those random sphere drawings that your high school art teacher made you do? That demonstrates a lot of the things that we learn in painting and values. So I really recommend Marco Bucci's painting videos on screen for this. He explains it so much better than I can, and with the time that I have in this video, yeah, really make sure to go check him out. But edges play a huge role in all of this value painting. Once I have the general shadows and tones mapped out, I do some basic refining and smoothing in certain areas to describe the forms in a soft way due to the softer lighting. This part of my process, I also try to focus a little more on texture and grain and let it do a lot of the rendering work for me and add some visual interest. Sometimes I find that my digital paintings get a little too glossy for my taste, so I really love the default gouache brush in Clip Studio Paint, specifically for like a grittier painting texture in some areas to bring more dimension to the painting. Once again, I find a lot of this process as set up for the more fun painterly parts in the future, and it just like gets all the hard stuff out of the way so that towards the end it's just like the fun painty parts. Okay, so after getting to a point where I feel confident about where the shadows are and I'm feeling ready to use color, I use one of the best inventions known to man, gradient maps. Gradient maps are a super cool way to instantly add color to your grayscale paintings. Now, this isn't a miracle worker. We still have to do some tweaks to get the colors that we want, but I love to use gradient maps as a head start to figuring out the color and getting rid of those dull grays. Gradient maps work as kind of a translator between value and specific colors that you select. You can set a certain color for each value on this gradient. I used gradient maps for my night painting from a couple months ago. I set the darkest value to be a cooler bluish green color and the lighter value to be a warmer yellower green color to give me a basic color foundation to paint on top of. I was thinking about the warmth of the lighting and the coolness of the shadow and put that into my gradient map to make it work as a strong foundation for that painting. But like I said, gradient maps are just the start. I really like to pair the gradient maps with color layer modes to add specific colors underneath or on top of the gradient map. In this case with Bill and Saul, I had a very warm gradient map color to mimic the lighting of the environment and achieve that warm spring feeling I wanted. But I still needed to paint in their skin tones, clothing, and objects, different colors, so not everything was like the same exact color based on the gradient map. So I just set up a color layer and started painting in the local colors, aka the true colors of the characters and their clothing. This brings more nuance and sophistication to the color while still keeping everything cohesive with that gradient map on top. It truly makes digital coloring so much easier if you're starting out, and it makes your paintings look a lot more cohesive. And my last step in all of this is to add an overlay layer on top of everything to accentuate certain colors. So areas on the skin that are warmer and the blood is closer to the skin, I typically add a reddish tint. I added more subtle saturated hues to warmer and cooler parts of the painting. It's hard for me to describe this part, but it's really just adding more saturation to like different areas that need it. And I also tend to saturate the terminator on a shadow on the form. Terminator is kind of like that contour line of the shadow that's the darkest part when rendering a form and typically holds a lot of saturation of the color. These overlay layers add more liveliness and vibrancy to the color and really start to make the painting pop. I also added a linear light layer on top to do the rim lighting around Bill and Saul and to do a sort of like highlight layer to add some more definition. I forgot to add it into my original script, but I just wanted to point that out. I also include add layers in my whole process, just like a general highlight layer to pop in some highlights and add more definition to the painting. Now, it's a little difficult for me to describe my rendering process. I still feel like it's not necessarily my strong suit when it comes to painting and cleaning things up. Sometimes I feel a little lost in this step of the painting. I've definitely improved over the last couple years. And because I did all this setup work of mapping out the shadows and color layers, I can just paint on top and clean up certain areas, refine them, smooth them out, and even add some details of clothing, foliage, and anything else that needs that extra oomph to it. This part of my process typically takes half or less time than the entire previous steps combined, just depending on how much of the painting was planned and how much upfront work I did. Usually 70% of the time is the planning and the prep work and the grayscale painting, and then the 30% is the fun rendering painterly parts and rendering the finishing details. I definitely think rendering is something that you just learn gradually as a painter from painting things yourself, as well as looking at the details of other artists' work. At least that's what's worked for me so far. You learn as you paint, and you learn what things you need to plan out or what things you don't, which makes you more efficient with your process in the future. Like I mentioned before, I really make sure I focus on the edges in my painting and maintaining clear value distinctions. Using my brush strokes to get a variety of hard and soft edges in a painting really keeps the technical side of my painting strong, so I can really use it to influence how I portray characters and the story I want to tell. A lot of these stroke styles were made during the grayscale painting part of this piece, but now it's time to really emphasize certain areas. So I mainly use the Lasso tool combined with the Airbrush to get really harsh edges in my painting, areas where I want the most focus and clarity, and then I use brushes brushes like the gouache brush and the round mixing brush to blend things out and get more of like a more natural, like wet paint look. I follow along the shadows I mapped out earlier and just add more definition, details, and play with color a little bit more and just add in little random hues that I like. That's basically the main idea I follow. I know it's kind of vague. I still struggle a little bit with rendering and figuring out what to do, but all of my rendering basically is just painting on top of the already established values and shadows that I did with the grayscale painting and just making it look nicer to the eye and more like polished looking. What is the most important aspect of this painting? Really make that area pop. You want to put the most effort and time into that place that you really want your viewer to look at. In this case, the focus of my painting is Bill and Saul, so I want to spend the most of my time on their facial features, clothing design, adding in a bunch of little details, and rendering to really make them stand out from the floral background. More intricate designs really stand out when we look at an image, so be mindful of where you're placing them. Throughout the process of this painting, I often think of little objects I can add or remove to add to the story of the painting. In this case, I added a little strawberry plant on Saul's side and a blueberry plant on Bill's side. I added more flowers blooming to signify a possible blooming of like a relationship, a love that's growing. These are additions to reinforce the feelings and emotions that I want this painting to convey. And then also one of the most fun parts of digital painting that I like to do is mixing the color of the objects that are next to each other. Like I said before, during the shading section, light can be bounced off of objects and so can color, because color in theory is light. So I really enjoy adding a bit of pinks from the flowers to Bill's clothing, as well as some greens and blues from the shadows in the grass. Kind of having these colors that are close to each other sort of bleed together is a painting look I really like to add to my work. Specifically with this painting, I ended up finding a lot of little fun rainbows popping up when I did this, which was really satisfying and a really cute addition to the painting. I also like to add some details to break up some larger areas of the painting that just need that extra something. Take for instance Bill and Saul's clothing. It just feels a little too flat and needs some detailing and embroidery or stitching to give it more design intentionality and really tie into the floral spring feeling. I made sure I had some clothing inspo and reference and just got to work on nailing that in. Of course, this is totally up to you, but I think this really elevates their design and interest as the subjects of the painting. I also make sure that there is a difference in how I render certain materials over others. So like the way I rendered the grass versus the way I rendered the figures, it's completely different. For the grass, I was using a lot of like soft painterly, like the Airbrush tool with the Lasso tool, like combined, while the figures was more with the gouache and more specific brush strokes. Throughout this rendering process, once again, I also try to zoom out a lot and look at the piece as a whole. Sometimes we can get caught up in rendering small pixels and cleaning areas up that don't really matter, or they end up changing the way a whole area looks. So make sure to zoom in and out and look at a painting from afar every couple of minutes or so. Then when I finally stop myself from picking at the painting and deem it as finished, it's time for a bit of color correction and some slight edits to really bring out the best areas of our painting. And that's the end of the tutorial. That is how I currently digitally paint. That's my whole process. This is just my whole process. I'm still definitely learning. I feel like I'll always be learning painting. Painting is just one of those things where there's so many different avenues you can go down, and just there's so much to explore and there's so much to learn. So I'd really recommend checking out the artists that I mentioned in this video and experimenting on your own and trying to find what works best for you. I do have to admit my process changes depending on the project and the amount of time I have to complete something. Sometimes I combine steps, sometimes I add steps. It just depends on what I'm painting. All in all, I really want to encourage you to experiment, keep practicing, and just try to improve a little bit with each painting instead of feeling like you need to figure everything out in one go. It's a lot. You have color, you have value, edges, all that crazy stuff, and it would be really great. Maybe you can spend a painting focusing on color or another one focusing on value and just taking everything a step at a time and just slowly accumulate those skills. Definitely check out the artist videos I mentioned in this video. They were immensely helpful in my own painting journey. Take it step by step, paint what interests you, and it will set you up for a rewarding and fun journey with digital painting. And that's what I've been doing, and despite the frustrations I may have during the process, the majority of the time it's super fun and a great way to express yourself and the stories that you want to tell with your characters. And thank you so much to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. It was a dream to be able to work with them, and they helped me so much in my own painting journey, and I hope you learned a little bit more about digital painting and my own process in this video. I definitely just scratched the surface with my process. There's so much more I could go into about like color and value and all those rendering tips. So I might make a follow-up video sometime soon. I'm not sure. I really like how bright and spring focused this painting turned out, and if you want to see more art like this, you can check out my Instagram and like and subscribe for future art videos like this. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Let me know down in the description if you want more specifics with anything or would want me to make a whole video about a certain part of my process. Alright, see you guys. Have a good weekend. Bye.